The goal of the results section is to only report the data. You are not creating any hypotheses or discussing what it might mean. It is a straight reporting of the results. So if you guys look at any peer-reviewed journal article that's been published, the results section, that's what it looks like. It is strictly the statistical analysis that's been done and reporting the demographic variable so that we can have a better sense as to what is the sample. In the discussion section, which will be due the following week, so it'll probably be due by Friday the 23rd. Actually, I may just make, yes, I take that back. That's due with your final paper because that's just the last piece. So that is going to be submitted alongside your final paper, the last week of class. That is where you make some inferences, some suggestion. You talk about limitations, talk about future research, and we'll talk about that more. But that's where you dive in as to what does the data mean. The goal of the results section is only reporting the data. So as I mentioned to several of you, I shared here, let me open up my screen. Hopefully all of you guys can see this. This is our Course Connect page. If you go down here, results section demographic table, and click that, this is the format you should be following. Now, you know, you can make some small differences with that, but this is the APA format version of reporting your demographic variable. And these are some ideas as to what demographic variable. Now I pulled this from another article. It's not identical to what sections you will have. You will likely have a gender section. You will likely have an age section. You may have whether there's student athlete, yes or no. If they're living on campus, yes or no. You may have race and ethnicity, maybe religious preference, depending on your study, you ask different questions. So the goal of this table is to provide information as to the participant pool, but it is not, right? Like you're gonna have a separate table where you discuss the results of your specific survey. So if you ask a question about mental health, you could write on there, in terms of depressed score, the mean depressed score was, and it would be written out as a sentence. Or if you said, I'm trying to think of some of your surveys, like number of people who reported, do you use a sleep aid? Yes, no, right? So that would be a yes or no question. You could write yes or no. We can't run a mean or standard deviation on that. So you would just report the numbers, okay? So, and let me just get my little pen out. Yep, that works. Okay, so this here, they noted N is 57. That was the total size of their sample. I am fine with you guys just having a heading that's N, and then you write the frequency. So for gender, again, this is your variable, right? So you're gonna write that. It's a left align writing, gender. You skip a line, and then there's like, you can look at your APA handbook. It's 3 or 4 space bar, and then you write all the options. So maybe for yours, you had female, male, non-binary, prefer not to say. You know, you may have had other options. And then you will write here the number of people who reported yes for that. So how many people said they were female? Write that number. How many people said they were male? Write that number. Now in this percentage column, again, Google Forms does a great job because it'll tell you what the N is and what is the percentage for it. So here you write the percentage. So that's how you would do that. Now, age is one of those things where I do not want you to write 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, you know, like write them all out and then write a frequency. It's much better to do a mean and standard deviation. Now, again, one of the things I didn't like about this table is obviously they wrote the mean and then in parentheses is the standard deviation. So up here, to me, this is not a good heading. A better heading would be a capital M, comma, and then you could do SD like that, okay? So that we know you're reporting the mean and standard deviation. Okay, so this is for the demographic variables. For your actual survey data, if you have some that have a mean and standard deviation, you can put them in a table. I don't have any problems with that. Sometimes it's a little faster to write it out and say, I'm going to give you an example. When asked on average how many hours of sleep they get, participants reported an average of 6.25 hours with a standard deviation of 2.5, right? A little simpler to just write a sentence. So that is appropriate. You can have below your demographic table, you may have a couple sentences describing your continuous variable, your interval ratio variables that you can do a mean and standard deviation on. If you don't have any, because you went straight categorical, that's okay. You can just then have a secondary table. No problem with that. As I mentioned in all of our class meetings, all of you have the same data, right? It's not like Grace and Greg, those are the two names I see, and Haley have different, provided you're all in the same group, obviously. You don't have different data. You all shared, so it's all pooled together, right? That was the whole point, so we can get a larger sample size. So I am perfectly okay with you guys dividing and conquering, right? So you could say, all right, Greg, you do the demographic table. Grace, you're going to do the write-up on the continuous variable and then share your data. And all of you guys are going to be turning in something fairly similar within your group, that is. But bottom line, you each need to turn in your own results section. You cannot just turn one for an entire group. So I just want to make sure that that was clear. Questions about this?
I have two questions.
Yeah.
So how do we get our data to like be in that format? Do we use like Excel or something?
Yes. So my recommendation would be, so there's two ways you can do it. You can insert a table. Let's see here. Oh, that's not what I meant at all. Okay, can you guys see a Word document here?
Yeah.
Okay, and then all my scribbles. Okay, let's do that. Need all that. Okay. You could go here to insert table, okay? Something like that, right? You could do that. And then write just gender, right? Whoops. And then over here, you do 1, 2, 3, 4, female, 1, 2, 3, 4, male, okay? And then, you know, you would have whatever number that would be, 45, and whoops, I keep doing that. 61, I don't know, I'm making stuff up. The main thing though, is then you need to format the cells appropriately, okay? So there is, there's gonna be a border at the top. You know, if you go back to the AP manual, there's gonna be a line here at the top, at the very top. But then there's no lines in between, as you guys can see over here. Do you guys see that? So just make sure you follow the format. So if you feel like it's easier to do in Excel, that's totally fine. If you'd rather do it in Word, that works too.
Sounds good. And then I did have another question. So for our group, we wanted to take a look into like specific like categories in regards to like gender and female, so like comparing it. So like that table had like, I don't know what exactly it was, but like let's say sleeping aids, yes or no. But if we wanted to look at the difference between the genders, do we have to like add a different category?
Right. So it would look, let's see. I just want you to, these are not great example. Yeah, I mean, this, it would be like that. That's not even a good example. Sorry, you would end up doing a crosstab or a pivot table. Okay, oh, here, that's a much better one. Okay, let me share the screen so you guys can see what I'm looking at. Do you see this up here?
Yeah.
Okay, so that, I mean, this is not identical because they have 4 categories here and 2 here, but that's what the table would look like. So you would have here gender, right? It sounds like it's gender differences. And then what was the other variable? Sleep?
Yeah, like sleep aids, yes or no.
Right. So then do you take a sleep aid? Yes, no, and then you'd have the numbers here. So it would only be a frequency. You're just looking at the number. You don't need to add the percentages.
Okay, sounds
And
good.
the way you would do that is you need to be in Excel. Remember how I showed you guys how to download the Excel format, and then you would click insert pivot table. You would select the variables that you want to pivot together, which would be gender, and do you use a sleep aid, and this would pop out. Now you would need to take that table and format it to be an APA format, which, as you can see, there's no lines in between here, there's just outside lines. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Does that help answer your question?
For right now, yeah.
Okay. And like I said, if you guys have more precise analysis that you would like to do beyond frequency, mean, standard deviation, please let me know and I'm happy to help. Again, this is not a stats class. You guys have all had stats, so hopefully that's still in your back pocket, or you can move the cobwebs away from your brain and find the data again or how to do it. But I don't want to be the thing that's taking you 4 hours to get through. That's not the point of this course. Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any other questions about the results section? No? Okay. Okay. So today we're going to be discussing how we run experiments when there is more than one independent variable. Here's that. Here's that. Okay. Can you guys all see it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. And the reason why we cover that is in the real world, if you're doing research, chances are you are using a more complex method. It's not just going to be what's the relationship between, again, like just as Ashley was bringing up, what's the relationship between gender and sleep? It's quite likely that it's going to be far more complex than that, and that you're going to be looking at crossover effects or interaction effects between multiple independent variables as they are predicting the dependent variable. So that's one of the main reasons why this is an important part of the lecture. Obviously, for the purpose of our research, this is far more complex. And then you get into factorial design, which we'll talk about today. That's beyond the scope, again, statistically, but I just want to make sure you guys are exposed to it because that's, again, you'll see that in the literature all the time. All right, so we're going to start with a quick review as to what is an experiment with an independent variable when there's only one. And then we'll talk about the difference when there are multiple independent variable. We'll talk about factorial variations. We'll kind of just touch on it. And then we'll try to figure out like when can you identify factorial designs when you're reading specific empirical research. All right, so these are examples of single factor or single independent variable and dependent variable. So this is an interesting one that is going to be brought up again in a little bit. So this is the relationship between alcohol intake and aggressive tendencies. So part of the theory is that there is a relationship between ingesting alcohol and then exhibiting aggressive behavior. So let me read to you how they ran the study. So the placebo group, which would be this pink one right here, drank orange juice with a really tiny amount of vodka in it. And the alcohol group drank enough vodka to reach a 0.10 blood alcohol concentration. So this is this drunk group, right? They're above 0.08. They're classified in the drunk group because it's 0.10. Again, I always love these studies. I'm like, where'd you get participants for this? They're like, can you come be in my study? I'm just going to get you drunk and I'm not going to charge you for the alcohol. Maybe they park themselves next to a bar. So they ingested the alcohol, really small amount, much larger amount. And then they played a computer game with an opponent who was in another room. Now, this is kind of Milgram-esque because the opponent was actually just the computer. There was no person on the other side. But the idea is similar because there is some, they're obviously not telling the whole truth to the participant. They're telling them there's another player in the other room when really it's just the computer. And whenever the player would make a mistake, the participant actually introduced a shock as punishment. So again, see what I mean about very Milgram-esque. Both the intensity and the duration of the shock were measured. So how high of a shock they gave and how long they gave it. So the top graph right here shows the intensity of the shock between the two groups, and the second one shows the duration of the shock. So what interpretation can you draw from those two tables or graphs?
The individuals who were in the drunk group tended to give more intense shocks than the placebo group.
Yep. Absolutely. What else do you notice in the bottom graph?
The individuals in the drunk group had a longer duration of shock compared to the placebo group.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So why do we think that is? What might be some hypothesis you would draw from that?
I feel like because when you're drunk, you have less of like a perception of people's pain because you aren't really thinking about it. So that could be it.
Okay, good.
You also, like, when you drink alcohol, you expect it to make you more aggressive. So like that makes you more aggressive.
So I found this fascinating because I've certainly seen mean, angry drunks, sure. But on the whole, I'm like, people tend to just be more chill. Has been my experience. So I found this kind of interesting. All right. Any other conclusions you might draw from this? Or thoughts as to why it's like that? I think the duration of the shock, if you're really inebriated, you may not recognize you're pressing long, right? Like it may just be that your reflex or your ability to move quickly is gone. And so then you're pressing longer. So I wonder if that's because if that effect specifically is a secondary to being drunk or if it's because it shows aggressive tendencies. I think that would be hard to parse out. But anyway. All right, so let's talk about the second graph. So this particular study done in 2004. So again, let's put that in the time frame. 2004, there are no laws quite yet as to driving without holding your phone, right? Like that came later. But there was definitely a thought that if you were driving and talking on your cell phone, that you would have a reduced response time in braking. So what they did is they put, and this was actually hands-free cell phones. So some sort of Bluetooth, or maybe there was like they were wearing headphones or like the iPod things anyway. And then they had them playing a driving simulation game. So imagine if you're like in the arcades, right? Those like car driving racing games. And then one group was on their cell phone talking, right? Hands-free, but still on their cell phone. And the other group was not on their cell phone. And then they measured braking time. So that was a dependent variable. The independent variable is whether they're on their cell phone or not. So what conclusions can you draw from this graph?
Those who are on their cell phone have a longer braking time than those who are not on their cell phone.
Absolutely. So again, as you can see, this is the braking time in seconds. This is on your cell phone versus not. So what does that say about the impact of cell phone use while driving?
That when you're on your cell phone, it's more likely it's going to take you more time to react to whatever's happening. So
Exactly.
driving is probably going to be worse.
Yep. Very good. All right. So these are two examples where there's only one independent variable that is being measured or seen to or tested out to see the association with a dependent variable. In this case is the amount of alcohol they took, and this one is whether they're on a cell phone or not. Okay. When you run experiments with two independent variables, the benefit of doing that is it can show interactions between independent variable. Okay. Those are called interaction effects. So it's when the effect on one independent variable impacts the effect of the other. Okay. It allows us to see, to really like parse out whether or not there is an interaction, and we can actually say, well, it depends, right? Because with a cell phone, right, the previous example, I can say, well, being on your cell phone increases your break time. So it is acting as a distractor. If you introduce another independent variable and there's an interaction between the two, then you could say it depends. If one is high, the other might be low. And, so that opens up the room of complexity within research. So one of the example they use specifically with the cell phone example is that if you run this again and you introduce another independent variable, let's say age, well, now we could say it depends, right? So if you can say, well, the older you are, the slower you are at break time. But if you're on a cell phone or not, you see an additional decrease. We'll talk about that again in a second in terms of interaction effect, but that would be one of the benefits of having multiple independent variables is you get richer, more complex data, okay? In factorial design, you can test those limits. So again, specifically, who does the independent variable actually affect? And does it work in only certain situations? Because then again, we can parse out a secondary independent variable. So because of that, factorial design allow us to test more complex theories. And it looks at a main effect and an interaction effect. In other words, the independent variable strictly interacting or being associated with the dependent variable, and then the two independent variables relating to one another and then impacting the dependent variable. So that would be main effect is just one-to-one, interaction effect when there's multiple independent variables. So here's an example of that. So how much do you like these foods? So there's ice cream and pancakes, right? But then we add a secondary variable, which is the temperature of the food. So you notice this? So if people say, how much do you like ice cream? They may say, well, I like it, but only if it's cold, right? I like it a lot when it's cold. I don't like it when it's ice cream soup, right? I don't like that. Same thing. How much do you like pancakes? Well, I like it a lot when it's really warm. I don't really so much care for it when it's cold and rubbery. So you see how here there is an interaction effect, okay? So the dependent variable is how much do you like the food? And that interaction is a crossover interaction because the two lines actually cross, right? So how much you like certain food becomes completely dependent on its temperature. Okay, I'm sure you guys can come up with other foods like that where you're like, eggs. I don't like cold eggs. I like them warm, right? So again, it all depends, right? So that qualifier of it depends is because we've introduced another independent variable that is temperature. Okay, here's another interaction. So this is another fun one. So this is how long a dog will sit based on whether you say nothing, you just look at them, or if you tell them sit. And then here's the other interaction effect is whether or not you're holding a treat, okay? So if I say nothing and I'm holding a treat, the dog doesn't seem to sit down for a whole lot. But if I say sit and I don't have a treat, not a whole lot. But now if I'm holding a treat, the dog is willing to sit for a lot longer, okay? So again, I'm looking at, this is a spreading interaction is what it's called. So whether or not the dog sits depends whether or not I'm holding a treat, okay? So the saying sit or saying nothing is also impacted by the presence of the treat. This bottom graph is the same, we're just kind of switching it. You see how we're swapping here the independent variables. And that's another beauty of doing more factorial design or crossover interaction, is that you are able to swap your independent variables as they relate to the dependent variable. Does that make sense, gang? Okay. So factorial design is an experiment in which there are two or more independent variables. And in this case, the independent variables are called factors. Okay. You can use factorial design to manipulate variables or participant variables. Obviously, we cannot manipulate age, but we can classify participants by age, gender, ethnicity, for instance. So this particular study, this is following up on our cell phone example. There's two specific independent variable, cell phone use and driver's age, okay? So you can see here, those are our four categories that we're going to be looking at. So, excuse me, are they on their phone or not? Are they young or are they old? Leads to these four possibilities, okay? If you were graphing it, those would be four different cells. So we'll see what that looks like. In fact, let's go to that. So then we could see this is the braking time, right? So you've got younger drivers if they're on their phone versus not on their phone, older drivers if they're on a phone versus not on their phone, okay? So this shows main effects. There is really not much of an interaction. On the whole, we see that older individuals are slower at braking than younger individuals, but it's not a it depends situation, right? It's just a clear line for both ages that your braking time is increased if you are on your cell phone. So that is not a dependent, right? So it's not like, well, young people are phenomenal even on their phone. They're great multitaskers. No matter what people tell you, they're not good at it. So these show main effects. Let's see if there's anything else I want to tell you about that. Yeah, there's no interaction. Yeah. Okay, now we can test the limits too. That's one of the form that we talked about. So this is a way to check for external validity. So you can test limits. And again, for the alcohol and aggression study, they took a little twist on it. So if researchers started wondering the effect of alcohol on aggression, but based on body weight, right? So maybe there's something to do with that. So they assigned men to randomly to a drunk group and a placebo group, and then they measured their aggression. Again, same, the game. So shock intensity and then shock duration. But looking at the two graphs, right, they're the same, except the independent variable was swapped around. The effect of alcohol was very strong for then heavier men. So we see right over here, we've got the lighter men, right? And how it impacted their scores. We see that the placebo group, if they weren't quite drunk, their scores were really all the same. But look at this increase here in the drunk group. So it does seem like there is a greater impact if you were heavier set. So again, the idea of body weight impacting it. You can also look at, again, the testing the limits is looking for moderators. So a moderator, which we've talked about before, right? It's when there's an additional, right, independent variable that is impacting the relationship between the independent variable and dependent variable. So it results in this case in an interaction. So the effect on one independent variable depends on the level of another independent variable. And in this case, it would be body weight. So if we swap this around, you see the placebo group and the drunk group, and then we put the weight, the body weight, in this category. So you see for lighter men, there's a small difference, but for heavier men, here's our crossover effect, right? It gets much higher. So that is indicative of a crossover interaction. And specifically, it acts as a moderator. So your body weight moderates the relationship between alcohol intake and aggression. Everybody tracking with that? Okay. You can also use factorial design to test theories. In fact, most of the research and experimentation we do is because we want to test out some hypotheses and theories. So there's many theories that make prediction about how variables may interact with one another. Factorial designs are a good way to test it out to see if it is actually consistent with what you are theorizing. So again, you can use that factorial design to test a theory on alcohol cues, which we talked about, right? Like seeing ingesting alcohol may lead to an increase in aggression. Now, this particular next study we'll look at is that you will, if you're cued by signs of alcohol, you're more likely to show aggression. So it's not even ingesting it, it's just visual cues. So for this particular experiment, I'll talk about in a minute, they used an interaction to test a memory theory. And then it looks at context dependent theory. So let's dive into it. So this is the factorial design to test the theory of alcohol cues. So participants were shown either a picture of alcohol or a picture of a plant. Then they were given some words. Some were aggression related words and others were just identified as neutral words. Again, the theory here is that alcohol can become cognitively associated with thoughts of aggression. So this is how I would frame it, right? I've got two independent variables in predicting this reaction time or in seeing the interaction with the reaction time. So whether they were shown aggressive words or neutral words, and whether they were shown or cued with a picture of alcohol or a picture of a plant. Again, the hypothesis was that participants would respond more quickly to identify aggression-related word if they had been cued with an alcohol photo. Okay. Again, I just want to really reiterate the way this worked. It was a string of letters that made up an aggression word or was just a non-word. Okay. All right. And here were the results. So we can see that if they were shown or cued with an alcohol photo, they got 551. So that was their reaction time. So it was quicker reaction than if they were cued with a plant photo. Similarly with, if they were cued with an alcohol photo, here's their reaction time for neutral words. It was longer than if they were cued with a plant, the plant photo, okay? So this is how it would be shown. So if, again, you're cued with the alcohol photo, here's the reaction time, right? So we got 562 and here we got 551. And then we see the increase in reaction time for the aggression related word if they were cued with a plant photo. Okay, so this is showing, again, when they've been primed with a photo of alcohol, they identified aggressive words more quickly. So this is supporting the theory that people cognitively associate alcohol cues with aggressive concepts. Okay, what do we think about this?
So they did associate. There was a successful association.
If they what? Sorry, I missed the first part.
There was a successful association.
Yep, because you can see here, there's a crossover effect, right? So you could see that being cued by the alcohol picture first led to a much reduced reaction time to identify an aggressive word than if they were cued with a random neutral photo, like photo of a plant. But again, we've got that second piece, which is a neutral word. So it's not like cueing you for an alcohol photo makes you much faster identifying everything, because that same group of people who were cued with that alcohol photo had a much slower reaction time to identify neutral words compared to the plant photo. Okay, kind of interesting stuff. All right, you can also use interaction effects in factorial design to test memory theory. So let's talk about that one. This is back in 1975. So they tested a theory about context-dependent memory using a factorial design. this is the idea, and I don't know if you guys have heard that before, but if you're going to study for an exam, you're more likely to recall parts of what you've studied if you're in a similar contextual environment as when you'll take the test, right? You're trying to match as much as the contextual factors as you can so that you can then recall more effectively during an exam. This is something, right? Kind of makes sense. Okay. So they predicted that when people study words to memorize them, they associate the words with the surrounding context. And when they try to remember the words later, they will perform better if they're in the same context. So these specific participants were actually scuba divers. And there was two specific independent variables. One is the learning condition. Did they learn the words at the water's edge, or did they learn them underwater? Again, I love that. Who got funding to do this? Like, we're going to do a scuba experiment to test memory. It seems like you could have just gone to a college campus and have students study in the classroom where they were going to get the test versus not. But, you know, I guess I'm thinking more economical experimentation. So that was the learning condition. Did they learn the words at the water's edge, or did they learn it underwater? And then the recall condition, same thing. When they were asked to recall the words, were they at the water's edge or were they underwater? Okay, so that's what we're looking at, the two conditions for each independent variable. And they found that participants who learned the material underwater remembered it best when recalling it underwater. And similarly, those who learned it at the water's edge were better at recalling it at the water's edge. So the finding is supporting the theory of context-dependent learning. Okay, so here it is again. If you learned at the water's edge, right, you performed better if the recall was also at the water's edge. And similarly, if you learned underwater, you recalled better when you were underwater. See the increase here and obviously the decrease over here. So this is another interaction test, okay? All right. Now, how do we interpret these? And I started talking about that a minute ago. So there is going to be a main effect, which is there an overall difference? You're looking at more of just one independent variable affecting the dependent variable. That is the main effect. The interaction is there, the question you're asking, is there a difference in the differences? So again, if you're splitting off your independent variable, you're asking, is there a difference between the difference in response between your independent variable? So is there a difference at water's edge versus underwater, right? You're looking at the main difference. And the interactions tend to be more important than the main effects, because again, it gives you more rich data as to what is happening and how is the dependent variable most affected. So again, that's another way to look at it. And it is possible to have both a main effect and an interaction effect in a 2x2 factorial design. In fact, let's look at it. So is there an overall difference? So the main effect I'm trying to figure out is there an overall effect of one independent variable on the dependent variable? The top figure right here is the word association study. So you see the alcohol cue and the plant cue and how it leads to the aggressive and neutral identification of words. So again, you could see the main effect for this and the main effect for the phototype, okay? The way you would do that is you compute the reaction time to aggressive words and reaction time to neutral words by averaging across the two conditions, okay? So you create this average of these two and average of these two, okay? The marginal means for aggressive and neutral words are in the far right-hand column right over here, okay? Those are the marginal means that we're looking for. So we want to notice that there's not actually much of a difference. 555 to 557, that's not a huge difference. So it appears that there's not a main effect in the phototype. So then you would compute the reaction time after seeing the alcohol photos over time. Again, what is our main effect? 556 versus 555, there's no main effect, okay? So looking at this, there's not just a main effect going on based on just the one independent variable. So it would not be a statistically significant main effect, okay? So then that's really showing that there is an interaction effect, and that's the biggest piece. In this one, we're comparing here 491 versus 6.60. How do we feel about that? That's a much larger difference, right? Okay, so that would be a main effect. The drinking condition has an impact on the shock intensity. And we kind of talked about that at the very beginning, how that's a main effect. But now body weight and the impact on shock intensity, these are very close again together. So less of a main effect here. It's important to note that even if you have a main effect that is significant, it doesn't mean that that is the most important finding in that analysis. Like for instance, right here, there's a significant main effect, but it's even more interesting when you look at the interaction effect. That yes, the group that you're in for your drinking group, placebo versus drinking, is impactful, but it's even more impactful if you're adding weight, okay? Does that make sense? You guys are really quiet today, so I can't tell if this is going above your heads or it's like, oh yeah.
Yeah, it's making sense.
Thanks, Greg. All right. So again, an interaction is finding the difference in differences. It's kind of a mouthful. So how do we detect interactions from a table when you're just flat out looking at it? So the table on the top here shows how to compute the interaction for the alcohol and aggression study. So there is an interaction in the difference of the differences. Okay, again, kind of funky. So the difference right here, right, is 11 points. You're doing 562, or you can do it the other way around, 551 minus 562, it's negative 11. Here, you're doing 559 minus 552, the difference is 7. This shows there is an interaction because we're going in opposite ways, okay? Right over here, if we look at the difference on this side, 912 minus 780 is 132. 1086 minus 912 is 174. These differences are not significantly different. In fact, they're going in the same direction. Do you guys remember the graph that went with it? That shows it's not an interaction effect, whereas this one is. Yeah, does that make sense? Okay. When you look at a graph, how do we determine whether there's an interaction effect? Well, it's a lot easier because it's just far more visual, right? So the results are plotted in a line graph at the top so that you can see more easily when there is in fact an interaction versus just a main effect, okay? If you're looking at bar graphs, it can be a little bit more challenging, but if the lines are parallel or not is what will determine whether there's an interaction effect or not, okay? See how here, if I follow the yellow line and then I follow the pink line, they cross over. If I follow the yellow bars and the pink bars, they're parallel. So if they're parallel, we are not looking at an interaction effect. If they actually cross, we are looking at an interaction effect. So that's how you would be able to tell just visualizing it. Okay, make sense?
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, is there a difference in the differences? So when we describe an interaction in words, you should start with one level of the independent variable, because again, you'll have two, and explain what's happening with the independent variable at that level for the other independent variable. So this shows when people, so this particular graph right here, when people recall at water's edge, they do better if they learned words at the water's edge. When people recall water underwater, they do better if they learned underwater, okay? So that is describing one condition of the first independent variable as it relates to the other, okay? So you keep it in the same line. Similarly, drinking makes everybody more aggressive, but this is especially true for heavy men. So this is acknowledging, right, the main effect, and then highlighting the interaction effect, which has to do with body weight. Okay. When a study is showing you both a main effect and an interaction, the interaction, and I said this earlier, is always going to be more important because it just provides you more data and more complexity as to the relationship between the independent variable. So we want to always take a peek at that. So looking at this graph over here, can you guys read it? It's kind of little. You can see there's a summary here of main effect. You'll see the main effects and the interaction effect. So this one has both a main effect and an interaction effect. You see here there is an effect as well, although it's not an interaction. And this one's just the main effect. Okay. There's a couple of other examples that I include here. It's just the writing is so small. You guys will need to take a peek at that on your own. But that can help to just, again, decipher. Big takeaway, if there's an interaction effect, that's the bulk of what you want to discuss in a discussion section. Main effects are important. Interactions effects are even more important. Okay. So here's some variations that you can use on 2x2 design. So if you do independent group factorial design, it could be alcohol, whether they have alcohol or not, or small amount versus large amount, and the weight, what body weight are they in? A within group factorial design would be getting the alcohol cues, right? Whether you're getting the alcohol versus a plant and the aggression word experiment. And then a mixed factorial design would be the cell phone use and age experiment, okay? You can increase the number of levels of an independent variable, and you can just increase the number of independent variables that are present. You could certainly do both of that. But as I suspect you can already figure out, the more you increase on either end, the more complex and harder it is to do, right? Okay. Independent group factorial design, then both independent variables are studied as independent groups. So that would be a 2x2 independent group design where there's 4 different groups of participants. So if you wanted 50 participants in each cell, you would need 200 participants total to participate in that. So here's what it would look like. So I would want maybe exactly the same number in each of these groups so that I'm comparing it evenly, right? Between my independent groups, the alcohol and the photo group. If I'm doing a within group, well, then maybe I can just repeat it, right? So I have these same 12 participants, I cue them with the alcohol photo and then the plant photo, and I see how they respond. Whereas these here are all different people, okay? Yeah. The mixed factorial design is when there's one independent variable that is manipulated as an independent group and the other one is manipulated as a within group, okay? So in this type, if I had a 2x2 mixed design with 50 people in each cell, I would need 100 participants because then I just have them, I manipulate the within group afterwards. Okay, here's what increasing levels would look like. And you can see here, it gets a little wild. So the cell phone condition from earlier, all we had earlier was the no phone, and then we had the hands-free phone, and then they introduced the handheld cell phone to see the impact, okay? So then from there, you can see how you get a little blimp, right? If you're holding your phone, you're definitely at the slowest response, okay? Then you could do the same thing. You've got the 3 conditions for phone, but instead of splitting it by young and old, I have 4 divisions here of ages. And you could see that, again, they're represented in these lines. So you see how complex that can get quite quickly? Hopefully, yes? All right. I can't tell if I've lost you guys. Hopefully this is not totally going above your head. We're almost done. You can look at main effects and interactions from a 3-way design. This, again, gets real complicated real fast because you've got the 2 conditions here, and then you split them up again, and then you split them up again with age. Again, if you see this in a research study, my only goal for this on an exam, you're not going to be asked to calculate whether there's main effect or factor, interaction effect. That's not the goal. My goal is to introduce you to some of these factors. So if you're reading a research article for another class and you see something like that, that you're able to make sense of this table. Because a lot of people would be like, huh, what am I looking at? So this is the amount of traffic that's present, right? So that is the first independent variable. Second independent variable is whether they're on their phone, right? Hands-free phone, no cell phone. Third independent variable is the age of the driver, young driver versus older driver. And your dependent variable is how quickly are they able to brake, okay? So we see in light traffic, they're much faster at braking, right? Regardless of age. You see the same thing, older, they're just much faster than if there's heavy traffic. So that's the first difference. Second difference is they are faster in all cells if there's no cell phone versus having a cell phone. And then the third thing that you can notice is that on all of these categories, although this one here is real close, most of them, younger drivers are faster at braking than older drivers. Okay, do you see how I was able to kind of quickly glance at the table and explain away the results? That's my goal, is that you guys can do that if you're seeing a research article. Okay. Do you guys think you could do that? If I gave you this on an exam and I asked you, what are the findings of the 3 independent variables, would you be able to summarize them the way I just did right now?
I think so.
Okay.
I think maybe like just a couple more times seeing it, and yeah.
Okay. So the main thing you need to do is right off the bat, identify what are my independent variables. So right away, by looking, to me, looking at the table is a lot easier than just looking at the graph. But looking at the table, I see the first independent variable is how much traffic is there, light or heavy. Second is cell phone use, no cell phone or hands-free. Third one is age, young or old. So those are my 3 independent variable. Then I need to identify what is my dependent variable. And that's always going to be a little easier because it's going to be written right here in the top. So it's how quickly are people able to brake. And then I take it from there by comparing the 2 groups in each cell to make a determination. Now, in my quick summary here, I didn't say whether it was statistically significant. That's beyond. I just want you guys to be able to notice trends and patterns. That's the goal. Okay. All right, so main effects and interactions from a 3-way design, okay? This is exactly what I was just doing. This is comparing each of the group. If there's a main effect for cell phone, age, and traffic condition, okay? And so it's quite simple. You just create the mean for all of the variables that are in there, each cell, and you get this marginal mean, okay? We don't need to do the math on it. We already kind of looked it over. Okay, this is the same thing, just again, plotting them in a line. So you could see the main effects versus interaction effects. So you can look at the differences of differences. We could see here, yeah, I mean, we just did all of that. Okay, and then you could see, are there 2-way interactions? Are they different? And does the 2-way interaction depend on the level of variable 3? Almost like a moderator effect, okay? So braking time, light traffic and heavy traffic, this here would show no, there's no 2-way interaction of light traffic and no 2-way interaction of heavy traffic. They're not crossing over. But here there is. So in this particular example, light traffic and cell phone use with age, there is a crossover effect, meaning in this particular example, younger drivers are much faster at braking when there's very little traffic and they're not on their cell phone compared to when they are on their cell phone, okay? And this is especially true when comparing it to older drivers. They experience a decrease in response time, but not nearly as significant as younger drivers. Okay. Again, this would be looking at different data and how that would change, right? So again, cell phone use with light and heavy traffic. This says there's no two-way interaction because both of them have crossover effect, okay? But here, the two-way interactions on the left side is actually the opposite. Look at this. So this is showing younger drivers have a really significant decrease with cell phone when they have when they're in light traffic. Whereas look here, the biggest significance is with older drivers, whereas younger drivers, it's just more of a slightly depressed. Again, this is all fabricated data. They're just showing us the different examples. So is the two-way interaction different? Yes, it is, because depending on the amount of traffic, young and older drivers respond differently, whether they're on a cell phone or not. Okay, so that would be a three-way interaction. Okay, why do we care about all this, right? This always feels like we need to bring it home. Why do we care? Well, most outcomes in social sciences and psychological studies, they're not main effects, but they're actually interaction effects. So we need to be really mindful of that. And in the real world, as I said at the start of lecture today, is most human behavior involve a lot of interactions and not necessarily main effect. If you think about it, very few times would you say, you know, the only thing that impacts this behavior is this one thing, right? It's not usually in a vacuum like that. There's multiple independent variables that affect a dependent variable. So when you look at interaction effect, you're really getting much closer to understanding the specific concept. Okay, in articles, how would you be able to identify those and how are you able to interpret them? So that's going to be part of your research design. And usually when you read an article, it'll say just that. We used a 2x2x2 factorial design. You want to look at specific wording. If it says it depends or only when, or it's moderated by, then we're looking at really an interaction effect in a factorial design because they're quantifying their results. If it was only a main effect, it would just be this impacts that, right? There would be no, it depends. It would just be like that all the time. Okay. I just mentioned this again, but if in the methods section, the way they would identify their specific methodology would be something like this. We did a 2x2x3 design, right? Or they may reference a MANOVA. That's a multiple analysis of variance. So you're looking at multiple, as opposed to an ANOVA, which is an analysis of variance. This you're doing it for multiple variables. Okay. How are we doing? Is this all making sense? Main takeaways, right? Okay, so 1, research in the social sciences usually has multiple independent variables. And usually we're looking at interaction effects rather than just main effects. Another main takeaway is if you look at a table, hello. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Did I just totally drop off?
Yeah, like 2 times, I think.
You were frozen too.
Yeah.
How long was I frozen?
For maybe like 30 seconds.
30
Okay.
minutes. Yeah.
I'm so grateful you didn't say 30 minutes. That would have
No.
been bad. Okay, was I going through my summary of main takeaways? Is that what I was talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Should I repeat that or you guys got it for the most part?
I didn't hear anything. It was just static.
Oh, okay. So main takeaways is understanding that in the social sciences, right, you're going to be looking at as a whole at interaction effects because nothing is singularly predictive, right? Like that's just not how human behavior is. So that's main takeaway. There's going to be a lot more interaction effects than main effects. Second, I want you guys to be able to look at a table and be able to make sense of it, right? So if I give you a 3x3x2 table that you're able to explain what you're seeing and able to just compare the values in very broad strokes. So I'm not going to be asking you guys to run math to see if it's statistically significant, but I want you guys to be able to get a basic understanding as to what you're seeing and whether that makes sense. And then third, similarly, you need to be able to look at a graph and be able to identify whether there is an interaction effect or just a main effect. And again, for that, you're looking as to whether there's an actual crossover in your graph or whether the lines are just parallel, which would be more indicative of a main effect. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. That's all I've got for you guys because I'm meeting with a group still right after this. So yeah, we're getting close to the end. Make sure that you get all of your data collected. If you have questions on specific analysis for your results section, please email me so that I can help you with it. Otherwise, the results section will be due on Tuesday, the 13th by midnight.
Thank
Sound
you.
good? No problem. All right, the group I'm meeting with, stay in this room. Everybody else, we'll see you Tuesday.